Hey y'all, here OS Reviews. Today we're taking a revisited review of the Samsung Galaxy A80 here in 2023. In many ways, this is a rather experimental phone for Samsung, which is unusual for this brand, since we often think of rivals like LG being more quirky with their smartphone design. But as you saw there, this phone is all about the nearly edge-to-edge display, at least back in 2019 standards, and that swiveling camera that goes from the back to the front. Benefits include taking higher resolution selfies using the primary lens and even having an ultra wide angle lens, not to mention it produces a nearly edge-to-edge display, as aforementioned, without any hole punch or cutouts at all on the 6.7-inch OLED display, which still looks gorgeous, I have to admit. Of course, Samsung was not alone in experimenting with the idea of getting a nearly bezel-less display. Other manufacturers around the same time introduced pop-up selfie systems, which has a similar benefit of having a larger screen-to-body ratio when the camera is not being used. However, the difference is it's only the selfie camera that pops up. The rear camera is still on the back, doesn't physically move. It's a much smaller mechanism that you can see with your eyes, versus on the A80 that's the entire crazy motion of raising all the way up and then swiveling around. So it's a two-stage action and more of a conversation starter when you're looking at it. That being said, it also is twice the amount of moving parts. And as a result, this is definitely not a phone that's going to be IP rated when it comes to water resistance, and also mechanical parts will inevitably fail over time. So the durability of a design like this is kind of questionable, but undoubtedly from an engineering perspective, it is quite cool to see. That being said, aside from that gorgeous display and swiveling camera system, the A80, like other phones in the Galaxy A line, is still more of their mid-tier, affordable offerings as opposed to the flagship Galaxy S series, which are also a little bit more mature. But it's also what makes the A80 more exciting, in my opinion, although it is packing mid-end specs, including the Qualcomm Snapdragon 730 processor. Built on an 8nm architecture, it's pretty energy efficient, and honestly, for day-to-day usage, it still feels fluid and fast enough. But if you're doing super heavy graphically demanding gaming, well, it's just not going to fare as well as an 800 or 8th Gen series chip. The phone is otherwise coupled with 8GB of RAM, sufficient I would say, and also 128 gigs of built-in storage. It also comes with a 3700 mAh capacity battery, though for a phablet-like device, again with a 6.7-inch screen, it's definitely not the largest cell that we have seen. This is more of a one-day phone as opposed to being an endurance champion, since some of the room has to be occupied by the motors. Now, speaking of, the camera system comprises of a primary 48-megapixel lens, in addition to an 8-megapixel ultra-wide, and also a time-of-flight sensor, which is capturing depth information. If you're capturing bokeh shots, it's going to be just a little bit more accurate. What you won't find here, though, would be a telephoto zoom lens. Now, there is no Qi wireless charging support, but again, considering the positioning of this phone, I wouldn't say that's too big of a surprise. The side rails are constructed out of aluminum alloy, though, and do feel quite premium as you're holding it in the hand. It has a little bit more heft than you might expect, again, probably thanks to the additional motors and mechanical parts inside. The bottom here houses just a single loudspeaker. There is no stereo unit on this phone, which is, I think, a little bit of a missed opportunity, but it is what it is. We'll do a demo later on, and the Type-C port for charging. At 25 watts, it's reasonably fast and tops up the cell here in around an hour and a half, although there is no DeX mode support. Again, kind of the norm for a non-Galaxy S series phone. There's also a power key on the right-hand spine, and on the left side, there's just a simple volume rocker. Turning on the phone's display, you'll find a under-display optical sensor, which is also relatively fast and responsive. And although the chin at the very bottom is just a hair wider compared to the top, left, and right sides, it still is a very impressive panel to look at, really immersive with vibrant-looking colors. That being said, this is a 60Hz refresh rate screen as compared to faster 90 or 120, since back in 2019, that was still not really common yet, I would argue. And as a result, if you're scrolling super quickly through longer lists, you may notice that if you are used to more powerful, newer flagships, but I would still say it's a reasonably smooth experience and doesn't really get in the way of you navigating around One UI 2.0 based on Android 10 that this phone is capable of being upgraded to. So not the newest anymore. That being said, you can still, of course, install the latest games and titles from the Play Store without too many problems. Like other Samsung devices that we have checked out recently, One UI is a pretty consistent and, in my opinion, very polished user interface by now. There are plenty of extras on here and utility tools which are created by Samsung that look quite cohesive. Similarly, small details including a haptic vibration motor is really well optimized on the A80, surprisingly, despite it not being an S-series device. It's very tight and gives you nice vibrations. That being said, it's definitely not stock feeling, and so if you want something super vanilla and clean, well, you're not really going to get that here. But at the very least, One UI is super simple to customize. It's kind of a kitchen sink approach when it comes to everything underneath the sun, including themes, wallpapers, widgets, transition effects can all be completely tweaked to your liking. That being said, there's still a little bit of redundancy when it comes to apps and content, such as Samsung having their own app store in addition to the Play Store being available, Samsung having their own browser in addition to standard Google Chrome, so you have a few ways of doing similar tasks. Now, one thing I have to mention about OLED or AMOLED screens is, especially on a used older model, there will inevitably be higher chances of screen burn-in as compared to IPS LCD panels like or not, especially if you have the screen brightness on for too high and kind of sitting in the same picture for too long, it may leave a bit of a shadow over time. It's not a problem that's unique to the A80 at all. I just want to point that out, especially since we're looking at a revisited older gen product. And now if you're considering one on the used marketplace, such as on eBay, it usually fetches for around $200 or so when you are shopping around. Definitely not bad, especially for such a unique phone that has still a very futuristic looking display and kind of motor system. But being upfront as far as value is concerned, this is definitely not the most bang for your buck that you can get if all you need is the fastest processor and latest gen specs. We have seen even better deals on devices, for example, rocking Snapdragon 855 processors, including Samsung's own Galaxy S10 phones can now be found at a similar price as well, which will get faster GPU and even CPU performance underneath the hood versus, again, the 730 found on the A80. So this is really for fans of a unique device in general rather than wanting absolutely the fastest specs underneath the sun. So taking a closer look at the camera performance here, the UI, I will say, is super familiar, but it's not bad. You're able to easily jump back and forth between the ultra-wide angle and the primary lens. At 8 megapixels, it's a little bit softer compared to current gen flagships that may have 12 megapixels or even higher, but still looks quite good in terms of color science and processing. Now down below here, we can also swipe between recording video, including 4K 30 FPS, and under more, you can also scan in barcodes, go into a pro mode that will allow you to adjust properties like ISO and white balance yourself, as well as a portrait mode can all be triggered here using the depth sensor, and that generally works well enough. As aforementioned, colors on Samsung cameras I do think are a little bit on the more saturated side of the spectrum, but nonetheless, they look quite good, although the sensor size is not as big as on more flagship-grade current-gen phones, so getting more natural bokeh. However, it still looks quite decent if you zoom in when it comes to, again, fine textures such as this leaf. Even this tree, which is a pretty difficult lighting situation since the background is brighter, is not blown out either. So I would say it's comparable to some of the older generation Samsung phones, including the S9, S10 series when it comes to general performance. You can't expect it to rival the latest gen from Samsung and Pixel devices anymore. However, it still fares decently, and you can be mostly satisfied with sharing these photos on social media or just for preserving your own memories with. There's also a demo of the difference in terms of field of view between normal and also the wide angle lens, so you can stand in the same position and capture more within the frame of your shot. Takeaway being that it's an above average camera. It's not going to be at the top of photographers' list, but more than good enough, and certainly is a huge step up, especially if you're using it as a front-facing camera. Lots of detail to play around with, very good HDR for taking portraits, and ultra-wide angle group shots as well. Now moving into a video playback and speaker demo. Overall takeaway being that despite being just a single speaker at the very bottom, it actually sounds surprisingly full and doesn't really distort at higher volume levels, although of course stereo will get you even more immersiveness. You can also use wireless headphones, and in general it's a pretty comfortable experience, especially this display, which again is so expansive at 6.7 inches. It's definitely more of a phablet or a larger phone, so if you're looking for something petite, this is not going to be it, but that's kind of the whole point of having this nearly bezel-less design. You take advantage of it by watching and consuming consuming media. Things like buffering times are all relatively fast and responsive, thanks to dual-band Wi-Fi as well as 4G LTE. Certainly didn't really have any problems in terms of dropped connection or signal, and in most cases, videos loaded up in just a split second. Also, if you are reading back articles and browsing the web, it's a super comfortable experience because of this gorgeous large display. And as shown here, even more complex sites like The Verge with plenty of videos as well as even advertisements sliced in between still loads up in a respectable amount of time, and scrolling back still feels generally smooth enough. And as far as doing a little bit of gaming is concerned, overall it's also not too problematic, I would say. Again, the 730 is still a relatively energy efficient, decent mid-tier chip. It's not going to fare the best if you're trying to go into competitive AAA territory with titles like PUBG and Asphalt, for example. You may have to lower some of the graphic settings. However, for more moderate games, more casual titles, things like Angry Birds as well as Stack, you certainly won't have too many problems there, and the phone still remains quite cool during operation as well. So thankfully, thermal throttling is not really an issue that you have to contend with. So that is more or less it as far as a revisited look back at the Samsung Galaxy A80. In a day and age where smartphones are becoming more and more similar to one another when it comes to design, I have to say it's kind of a breath of fresh air, especially to see Samsung try something so different. The sliding up and swiveling camera system is definitely really cool to see, even if everything else about this phone is definitely in the mid-range category, but it still is more than competent enough for everyday use. And so I would say these days, especially with a reduced price point that you can find these phones at, it can still be a decent choice if you're looking for a phone that has primarily an emphasis on design, a large display for media consumption. That being said, if you're looking for absolute performance, you don't necessarily care about having a slightly larger bezel or a small hole punch, well then you can definitely find better choices when it comes to a similar price point. Not to mention perhaps a little bit better longevity due to fewer moving parts. But again, still this is undeniably a very cool phone design from Samsung. So thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been our throwback review of the Galaxy A80 here in 2023.